Benny Hill was the most successful comedian the world has ever known.
For 2 decades, The Benny Hill Show ruled the airwaves. From New York to New Delhi, audiences laughed at the cheeky grin, the sped-up chases, the music that became an anthem of mischief. At its peak, the show reached more than 100 million viewers every week, a cultural force as unstoppable as the man himself. Then, in 1989, it ended. No farewell special, no explanation, just silence. One day, Benny Hill was the face of British comedy. The next, he was gone. Almost immediately, rumors began. Some said it was one scene, a sketch so outrageous it forced the network's hand. Others swore the government had pressured Thames Television to shut it down. The tabloids spoke of cancel culture long before the term existed. But the truth? The truth hid in St. Plain, buried under laughter, money, and shifting moral lines. Behind the cameras, executives debated whether the jokes had aged into cruelty. Critics claimed the humor was stuck in the 1960s, and audiences, the same ones who once tuned in religiously, were beginning to turn away. Ratings slipped, costs soared. The laughter still echoed, but it no longer sounded the same. Yet through all of this, one mystery refused to die. Was there really a single scene that took the Benny Hill Show off the air for good? Tonight, we're peeling back the story, how a comedy empire built on laughter became a cultural scandal, and how one of television's most iconic figures found himself laughed off his own stage. But before we reach that moment, we need to understand the man the world once called Britain's funniest export. Before the controversy, before the headlines, there was just Alfred Hawthorne Hill, a shy boy from Southampton who dreamed of making people laugh. He wasn't born into show business, he earned it, working backstage in theaters, memorizing routines, studying how timing could turn silence into laughter. By the 1950s, he reinvented himself as Benny Hill, a quick-witted comic who could play anyone, the flirt, the fool, the mock hero, even the woman in disguise. His genius wasn't just the jokes, it was how fast he delivered them. One character, one voice, one wink, and the crowd was his. Television found him at the perfect time. Britain needed laughter after the war. Hill's comedy, with its slapstick charm and cheeky irreverence, felt like oxygen. In 1955, The Benny Hill Show debuted, a half-hour escape from the grayness of post-war life. It grew fast. Sketches of bumbling policemen, exaggerated nurses, and men running after women to the sound of yakety sax became universal. By the 1970s, Benny Hill was a global phenomenon. He wasn't just on TV, he was TV. Sold to over 140 countries, watched by millions. In America, he was hailed as the British Chaplin. In Europe, he was seen as the face of English humor itself. But the same formula that made him a legend was also setting a silent trap. Because what the world called harmless fun, others were beginning to call something else, outdated. And soon, that laughter, the one Benny built his entire life around, would start to sound like mockery. By the mid-1970s, Benny Hill was untouchable. His face was on magazines, his sketches were quoted in pubs, and his trademark grin could stop traffic. The Benny Hill Show had become a cultural export as big as the Beatles or James Bond. For 30 minutes every week, Britain forgot its troubles, the power cuts, the strikes, the headlines, and just laughed. The formula was simple: slapstick, wordplay, and beautiful women caught in chaotic chase scenes. It was old-school humor dressed in television's new color. To millions, it felt innocent. To others, it felt tired. But no one could deny its reach. Yet beneath the applause, something subtle began to shift. Younger comedians, Monty Python, the young ones, were experimenting with satire, surrealism, rebellion. Their humor punched up, not down. Audiences were starting to crave something sharper, something that reflected the changing mood of Britain. Inside the studios at Thames Television, a quiet unease grew. Some producers wondered if the show had become too predictable. Others worried that its portrayal of women, once brushed off as playful, now looked out of touch. But Benny didn't see it that way. He believed laughter was timeless, that the same gags that worked in 1955 could still work in 1985. And for a while he was right. The ratings remained strong, the foreign sales boomed, the laughter roared. But cracks don't appear all at once. They whisper first, through a critic's headline, a fading laugh track, or a single awkward silence on set. And soon those whispers would grow loud enough to drown out the laughter altogether. By the late 1980s, the laughter began to sound different. It was still there, but quieter, thinner, less certain. Something had changed, not just in the studio, but in society itself. Britain was growing up. Television was changing. The rise of alternative comedy brought new voices, edgy, political, angry. Comedians like Ben Elton and Rick Mayall weren't tripping over banana peels or chasing dancers. They were taking swings at the government, the church, and the media itself. Their punchlines carried messages. Their shows had meaning. And then there was Benny, the old master of mischief, still running down hallways and fast forward, still surrounded by nurses, grannies, and bikini girls. The audience that once adored him now seemed split. Some saw him as a legend, others as a leftover. Critics began to circle. They called his sketches outdated. They said his jokes objectified women. And though Hill's loyal fans defended him fiercely, insisting that it was all innocent fun, one powerful question started to hang in the air. Was this still comedy, or was it cruelty dressed as laughter? At first, the backlash came in columns and reviews. Then it spread to talk shows, interviews, and debates about what kind of humor belonged on British TV. Producers grew nervous. Sponsors backed away. The same chases and winks that once made the world laugh now made it uncomfortable. Still, Benny pressed on, unaware that the scene that would end everything was already being written. And when it aired, it wouldn't just change the show. It would change how the world saw Benny Hill forever. It began like any other episode. The music, the laughter, the familiar grin. The studio lights hit the stage, and Benny Hill stepped into the frame. The audience ready for more of the same harmless fun they'd loved for decades. But that night, something felt different. The sketch was meant to be a light parody of a beauty pageant. The setup was simple. A group of women on stage, Benny as the cheeky host, tossing puns and double entendres. The audience chuckled, cameras rolled. Then came the moment, the one that crossed the invisible line. As the women walked across the stage, the jokes turned sharper, focused less on humor, more on their bodies. There were no witty punchlines, no clever reversals, just silence between uncomfortable laughs. What was meant to be satire suddenly felt like mockery. The crowd laughed, but not with the same warmth. The laughter had changed pitch, edged with confusion. The studio team felt it too. Something in the room had shifted, but no one said a word. When the sketch aired, it didn't just land as another Benny Hill gag. It hit like a cultural aftershock. Critics called it crude. Newspapers said it proved the show had gone too far. Feminist groups pointed to it as proof that Hill's comedy had lost touch with the times. For decades, Benny Hill had been Britain's clown prince, the man who made laughter simple. Now, overnight, he was the face of a fading era. And as the outrage spread, one man, a rising comedian, would step forward to challenge everything Benny stood for. The storm didn't hit all at once. It started as a drizzle, a few angry headlines, a couple of radio debates. Then came the thunder. The beauty pageant sketch gave critics a weapon they'd been waiting for. Newspapers ran with it. Columnists called the show a relic of the past. Letters poured in to Thames Television demanding change. And leading the charge was a new kind of comedian, Ben Elton. Young, sharp, politically fearless. He'd grown up watching Benny Hill, but now he represented everything he wasn't. His comedy mocked authority, challenged power, and refused to punch down. Elton said what many younger voices were already thinking, that Hill's show wasn't just outdated, it was dangerous. It turned women into punchlines, and laughter into a mask for something uglier. The quote spread like wildfire. TV talk shows debated it, newspapers reprinted it, and suddenly, Benny Hill, once loved by millions, was standing alone in a moral battlefield he didn't understand. Some defended him. It's just comedy, they said. He's a clown, not a criminal. Others weren't so forgiving. Feminist groups organized campaigns, and cultural critics used his sketches as proof that British humor had to evolve. Inside Thames Television, meetings grew tense. Executives whispered about brand image. Advertisers hesitated. Every new episode felt riskier to air. And Benny? He stayed quiet. No interviews, no defenses. He told friends he just wanted people to laugh again. But the world had already moved on, and it wasn't laughing with him anymore. Then came the call, the one that would end everything he'd built for over 20 years. In 1989, the laughter stopped. The call came quietly, almost politely. Thames Television executives summoned Benny Hill to a brief meeting. No cameras, no fanfare. Just a handful of men in suits and the unspoken weight of history pressing down on the room. They told him the words no performer ever wants to hear. The show has run its course. After 21 years on air, the Benny Hill Show was finished. There was no public firing, no scandal splashed across tabloids, just a clean break. The network blamed rising costs and declining viewership. But everyone knew the truth. The backlash had grown too loud, the controversy too toxic. The world that once cheered Benny Hill was now embarrassed by him. Each episode cost nearly £500,000 to produce, a staggering figure for the time. Ratings had fallen, advertisers were uneasy, and the cultural tide had turned. What once was a golden franchise now looked like an expensive relic. When Benny walked out of that meeting, he didn't shout or argue. He smiled, shook hands, and left quietly. But behind that smile, friends said, something inside him broke. He had devoted his life to laughter, and now the world had laughed him out of it.
At Thames, studio lights dimmed over an empty stage. Props were boxed up, sets torn down. And somewhere in a small London flat, Benny Hill sat alone, surrounded not by dancers or cameras, but by silence. He thought it was just another break. He thought they'd call him back. They never did. At first, Benny Hill treated the cancellation like a vacation. He told friends he was just resting, that Thames would call any week now. He even kept his scripts nearby, rewriting sketches that would never be filmed. But as months turned into years, that call never came. TV moved on. The new British comedy wave, The Young Ones, Blackadder, Absolutely Fabulous, defined the era. Smart, edgy, political. Everything Benny Hill wasn't. Yet, ironically, While Britain rejected him, the world still adored him. In the United States, reruns of The Benny Hill Show were huge. Across Europe and even in the Middle East, he was still a household name. He received fan mail from countries he'd never visited. But back home, he was a ghost. He'd walk through London largely unrecognized, living in the same modest flat he'd always kept. No luxury mansion, no entourage. His closest company? Old scripts, old tapes, and a small television that still played his own show on foreign channels. Friends said he grew quieter, withdrawn. He refused offers to appear on talk shows, refused interviews meant to redeem him. Benny didn't want to explain himself. He wanted to be funny again. But no one was asking him to. And as years passed, the laughter that once filled theaters became a kind of silence that followed him everywhere. In 1991, Thames Television itself lost its broadcasting license, a final twist of irony. The very network that had cut him loose soon disappeared too. But for Benny Hill, there was no victory in that. Only the faint glow of old fame and the long shadow of a man the world had already forgotten. Then, one spring morning in 1992, that silence finally deepened into something permanent. By 1992, Benny Hill was 68, still cracking jokes to himself, still convinced there'd be one more comeback. But his health was fading. Years of isolation and poor diet had caught up with him. He'd suffered heart trouble before, but refused to go to hospital. He brushed off concern with the same line he'd used for decades. "I'm fine, old boy, just a bit tired." Friends noticed he'd stopped answering the phone. Letters piled up unopened. The blinds of his flat stayed drawn. The once unstoppable entertainer now lived in a world of reruns, surrounded by videotapes of his own laughter, his only audience, the ghosts of his former self. In April that year, neighbors grew worried. A smell lingered in the corridor. When police forced open the door to his small flat in Teddington, they found Benny Hill sitting in his armchair, the TV still on. He'd been dead for several days, alone. The man who had made millions laugh had died in silence, his final audience a flickering screen. News spread fast, and suddenly Britain remembered him. Tabloids that once mocked him ran tributes. Fans gathered outside his flat, leaving flowers, photos, and letters. It was the cruel paradox of fame. In death, he became beloved again. There was no grand funeral, just a quiet burial attended by a handful of friends. No cameras, no applause, only the sound of rain and the faint memory of laughter that had once filled the world. But the story of the Benny Hill Show didn't end with his death, because years later, one scene, the very one that ended it all, would resurface, sparking a new debate. Was Benny Hill the villain or the victim of a changing world? More than 30 years have passed since Benny Hill's death, and yet the argument about him hasn't died. Some say he was a relic, a comedian who refused to grow as the world matured. Others insist he was unfairly erased, the first victim of what we now call cancel culture. But maybe both are true. In the 1960s and 70s, Hill's comedy captured a Britain that no longer exists. Cheeky, irreverent, playful. His sketches mocked everyone, including himself. For decades, that laughter united families across generations. Then culture shifted. Feminism grew louder. Television became sharper, more self-aware. The same jokes that once felt harmless now looked cruel. And the infamous scene, the very one that took the Benny Hill Show off the air, became the symbol of that shift. A single moment that revealed the end of an era and the birth of another. It wasn't the scene itself that killed the show. It was what it represented. A world that had laughed at one kind of comedy was now laughing at another. Today, reruns of The Benny Hill Show still air in over 100 countries. Clips circulate online, gaining millions of views from people who never saw the original broadcast. Some watch for nostalgia, others for history. A few to decide for themselves what was funny and what wasn't. And maybe that's the real story. Not how the Benny Hill Show ended, but what it says about us. How laughter, morality, and culture change over time, and who we leave behind when they do. Because somewhere in a dusty archive, that scene still exists, and every time someone presses play, the question returns. Was Benny Hill canceled, or simply caught between 2 centuries of comedy?